In this lecture, I'll briefly discuss 9 myths about terrorism that have been strongly influenced by black swan events like 9/11. I call these myths in the everyday sense that they are conclusions that are fictitious or unscientific. After introducing each of these myths, I'll use our global terrorism database to explain what makes each an unscientific conclusion. Myth number 1. Terrorist attacks were rapidly increasing in the years leading up to 9/11. The tragic events of 9/11 had an immediate and dramatic impact on levels of public concern about terrorism in the United States and well beyond. Accordingly, many observers assume that terrorist attacks and fatalities were up sharply in the years just before 9/11. But in fact, the GTD tells a different, more complicated story, as you will see in the next slide. According to our data, terrorist attacks reached their 20th century high point not in 2001, but in 1992, just after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Total attacks the year before 9/11 were about the same level as they had been in the mid-1970s. In fact, in the 4 years prior to 9/11, worldwide terrorist attacks were at the lowest level they had been at for 20 years. Since 9/11, total attacks have again increased considerably, so that in 2010, total terrorist attacks are once again nearly as high as they were in the early 1990s. Myth number 2. Terrorist attacks reach every corner of the world. The ubiquity of modern communication systems means that individuals are now continuously bombarded by images of terrorist attacks from around the globe. How many times have you seen the iconic 9/11 images of a fully loaded jet plane crashing into the World Trade Center tower? This blanket media coverage leaves the impression that no location on the planet is safe from terrorism. But in fact, our analysis of the GTD indicates that terrorist attacks are highly concentrated in a relatively few places, as you can see in the next slide. For example, the top 10 countries in terms of terrorist attacks account for nearly half of all terrorist activities in the world since 1970. So, about 5% of all countries account for about 50% of all terrorist attacks. 10% of the world's countries account for 75% of the world's terrorist attacks. Myth number 3. The U.S. is more frequently targeted by terrorists than any other country in the world. The devastating impact of 9/11 led many observers, both in the United States and abroad, to assume that the United States is the target of an inordinate number of terrorist attacks. However, when we use the GTD to examine the frequency of attacks and the number of fatalities by country, we find that the U.S. ranks about 14th in the world in terms of total attacks and about 16th in terms of total fatalities. These rankings are shown in the next slide. While the U.S. ranks 16th in terms of total fatalities, 90% of total U.S. terrorism fatalities since 1970 are accounted by the 4 coordinated attacks of 9/11. If these attacks are removed from the estimates, U.S. fatalities from terrorism are similar to fatalities for Canada or Greece. Myth number 4. Most terrorist attacks involve disgruntled groups and individuals from one country carrying out attacks on civilians in other countries. Again, the tremendous impact of 9/11 encourages us to think about terrorism as being mostly about unhappy individuals from one country attacking innocent civilians from another country. To examine this issue, my colleagues and I looked at the attack patterns of 52 foreign terrorist groups that were identified by the U.S. State Department as posing the greatest threat to U.S. security. There's a slide depicting these arrangements. Based on GTD data, we found that more than 90% of the 17,000 attacks carried out by these groups were actually domestic attacks. Thus, more than 9 times out of 10, these groups operated at home against local targets. This means that groups located in, for example, Pakistan, were far more likely to use terrorist violence against non-U.S. targets in Pakistan than they were to attack U.S. targets in Pakistan or to attack the U.S. homeland. Myth number 5. Terrorism is unrelated to traditional political grievances. Because of the seeming irrationality of the al-Qaeda-inspired 9/11 attack, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that a large number of terrorist attacks involve fairly rational political disputes over territory. When we use the GTD data to identify the most active terrorist organizations in the world, We find that a large proportion of them involve groups organized around disputes having to do with political control over territory, as shown in the next slide. Although there are major differences in terms of their orientation, what's shown in this slide explains in large part that all of the top 10 most active terrorist groups of the modern era, including Shining Path, ETA, the FMLN, the IRA, FARC, Hamas, and the LTTE, are involved in disputes over territory. Myth number 6, most terrorist attacks are incredibly lethal. Again, because of the highly lethal terrorist attacks of 9/11, it's easy to suppose that most terrorist attacks are incredibly lethal. But as shown in the next slide from the GTD, we find that more than half of all terrorist attacks since 1970 involve no fatalities. How can this be, that so many terrorist attacks do not in fact result in fatalities? Many incidents are directed at property, at bridges, electric plants, factories. Other attacks are aimed at civilians, but they fail. And in many other cases, terrorist groups provided a warning to civilians before striking. This has been a common practice for ETA and the IRA, and used to be a common practice for the Weather Underground. 30 years ago, these considerations led terrorism researcher Brian Jenkins to suggest that terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. Of course, it's still the case that nearly half of the attacks in the GTD, over 50,000 attacks, produced at least one fatality. Nearly 2% of the attacks in our database, about 1,200 attacks, produced more than 25 fatalities. And in fact, Brian Jenkins recently revisited his earlier statement, and after reviewing the attacks by terrorist groups operating in the early 21st century, concluded that indeed many of today's terrorists want a lot of people watching and a lot of people dead. Nevertheless, about half of all terrorist attacks since 1970 produced no fatalities. Myth number 7. Most terrorist attacks rely on sophisticated weaponry. The coordinated attacks of 9/11 involve long-term planning, split-second timing, and an innovative use of existing resources. And the sophistication of 9/11 pales into insignificance compared to the diabolical sophistication of the enemies that Claire Danes, Kiefer Sutherland, Bruce Willis, and other television and media heroes routinely face. These images no doubt encourage us to think that most terrorist strikes depend on sophisticated weaponry. But contrary to the view of terrorism that we commonly get from Hollywood, the vast majority of terrorist attacks rely on non-sophisticated, readily accessible weapons. This is demonstrated in the next slide. According to the GT database, 80% of all attacks rely on explosives and firearms, and for the most part, the explosives used are relatively common, especially dynamite and grenades. Similarly, the most common firearms are also widely available, including especially shotguns and pistols. Fortunately, sophisticated weapons, including chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear weapons, are the rare exception. Myth number 8. Most terrorist organizations are long-lasting and difficult to eradicate. Given the persistence of high-profile, long-lasting groups like Al-Qaeda, the Tamil Tigers, or the Irish Republican Army, there's also a common perception that most terrorist groups have long lifespans. The GTD identifies more than 2,000 separate terrorist organizations. We gauge their longevity by the amount of time from their first strike to their last known strike. In the next slide, we show a distribution of terrorist strikes over time. We find that nearly 75% of the terrorist organizations identified in the GTD lasted for less than a year. Most terrorist groups are like most business startups, very likely to disappear during their first year of operation. Forming and maintaining groups is not all that easy, despite impressions to the contrary from the media. Why do we have the impression that terrorist groups are long-lasting and difficult to eradicate? Probably because we hear so much about the few groups that are successful. But for every Al-Qaeda and ETA, there are many more short-lived, relatively unknown groups, such as the anti-capitalist brigades and the revolutionary flames. Myth number 9. And finally, terrorist groups are impervious to government counter-terrorist policies and rarely make mistakes. We could call this the myth of the super-terrorist. The advanced planning, confidence, and destructiveness of 911 contributed to the notion that terrorist groups are infallible. My colleagues and I at the START Center have been involved in several research projects using GTD data which suggest otherwise. For example, in a recent study, we used the GTD to examine the targeting strategies of the Armenian Secret Army for the Liberation of Armenia, ASALA, a very active group based in Turkey. In the next slide, we show a list of attacks by ASALA. We are especially interested in ASALA because after mounting a long series of deadly terrorist attacks throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the organization disappeared very rapidly. After modeling many possible explanations for this sudden desistance, our conclusion was that the most convincing explanation was a strategic shift by ASALA in its targeting strategy. Before the early 1980s, ASALA was careful to target Turks and avoided non-Turkish and especially Armenian casualties. But starting in the early 1980s, they became far less discriminate in their targeting methods. The pivotal historical event in our analysis was an especially brutal attack on Paris's Orly airport in 1983. An explosive device detonated prematurely in the terminal area by the Turkish Airlines counter, killing 8 people and wounding over 50 more. The increasing reliance on random, brutal violence, such as the attack on Orly, created a polarized and hostile climate among the former supporters of ASALA. This change in targeting strategy seriously undermined the legitimacy of ASALA among its supporters in the Armenian diaspora and in the West. ASALA seriously miscalculated the impact of their changing strategy on their supporters. But there are plenty of other examples of misjudgment and even outright incompetence among terrorists. For example, less than 90 minutes after detonating a massive truck bomb in front of the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City in 1995, Timothy McVeigh was arrested for driving without a license plate. Similarly, in 1993, a group of Islamic extremists drove a rented bomb-laden van into the underground parking lot of the World Trade Center complex and, using a timer, set the bomb to detonate. When the bomb exploded, it killed 6 people and wounded over 1,000 more. Remarkably, 3 hours after the explosion, one of the chief conspirators in the plot, Mohammed Salameh, returned to the Ryder rental agency in New Jersey to get his deposit for the rented van back. It gets even better. When the rental company refused to return his $400 deposit without a police report, Salameh went to the police to report the van stolen. Eventually, Salameh's desperate attempts to get his $400 deposit back unraveled the entire conspiracy. So contrary to our stereotypes based on 9/11 and a few other extraordinary events, many terrorist attacks for the past 4 decades have relied on readily available, unsophisticated weaponry and frequently involve few or no fatalities. The typical terrorist group disappears in less than a year, and there's ample evidence that terrorists frequently make strategic errors. Attacks were declining just before 9/11, and very few attacks involved disgruntled groups from one country attacking civilians in another country. I again want to close this lecture with a slide suggesting a couple of sources that you may turn to if you're interested in learning more about these topics.